Millionaire invites her black maid son to play chess as a joke. She didn't know he was a child genius. Carmen Santos had cleaned Victoria Whitman's Beverly Hills mansion for 20 years. 20 years of polishing marble floors that cost more than her annual salary. 20 years of dusting crystal chandeliers while her own home had a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. But tonight felt different. Tonight, as she arranged canapes on silver platters worth more than her car, Carmen felt a knot forming in her stomach. Her 17-year-old son, Diego, was helping her serve at another one of Victoria's charity galas, and Victoria had that look in her eyes. The same look she got when she wanted to show off. Carmen knew that look meant trouble. "Diego, come here," Victoria's voice rang out across the living room, cutting through the polite chatter of Beverly Hills elite. "I want to show my guests something amusing." Carmen's hands trembled as she set down the tray. She had spent 17 years protecting her son from moments like this. 17 years teaching him to be invisible in houses like this, to serve quietly and leave without drawing attention. But Victoria Whitman had other plans. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced to her guests, gesturing toward Diego like he was part of the evening's entertainment. "How about we see how they play chess in the slums?" The laughter that followed felt like glass breaking in Carmen's chest. She watched her son's face, watched him process the insult with the same quiet dignity he'd shown since he was small, the same expression he wore when kids at school made jokes about his secondhand clothes, when teachers assumed he couldn't keep up with advanced classes. Carmen wanted to grab Diego's hand and walk out, wanted to tell Victoria Whitman exactly what she thought of her charity and her condescension. But she needed this job. Needed the $800 a week that kept food on their table and Diego in school. So she stood silent and watched her son become a spectacle. "I bet he doesn't even know how the pieces move," whispered Mr. Hamilton, owner of 3 hotel chains. His voice carried just loud enough for Carmen to hear, just loud enough to twist the knife. More laughter rippled through the room. Carmen closed her eyes and remembered Diego at age 9, finding that torn chess book in the library trash. Remembered him asking her to teach him the basic rules. Remembered telling him they couldn't afford lessons or a proper board. She remembered the determination in his young voice. "That's okay, Mama. I'll teach myself." And he had. While Carmen worked double shifts cleaning office buildings, Diego walked 3 miles to the public library every day after school. While she scrubbed toilets and emptied trash cans, he studied chess books that were falling apart. While she came home exhausted at midnight, he was still awake, analyzing games on a broken computer he'd somehow managed to fix. Carmen had watched her son transform himself through sheer will, had seen him memorize opening sequences and endgame patterns, had listened to him recite the names of grandmasters like other kids recited baseball statistics. But she had never seen him play against someone who took the game seriously. And now, Victoria Whitman wanted to use her brilliant boy as entertainment for people who thought poverty was a character flaw. "Come on, Diego," Victoria continued, settling into her leather chair like a queen on a throne. "Show us what you've got. I promise to go easy on you." Carmen bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. Diego walked to the chessboard with steady steps. "No agitation, no fear." Carmen knew that walk. It was the same measured pace he used when he was completely focused, when he was calculating something the rest of the world couldn't see. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Whitman," Diego said quietly. His voice carried none of the nervousness Carmen felt churning in her own stomach. Victoria smiled with the confidence of someone who had never lost anything that mattered. "I'll play white, of course. Family tradition." Carmen watched her son nod and arrange his black pieces with precision that made her heart skip. Each piece placed exactly in the center of its square, perfectly aligned, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Which, Carmen realized, he probably had, in his mind, on that broken computer, in the library with those falling apart books. The guests gathered around the board like spectators at a gladiator match. Carmen could see the anticipation in their faces. They were expecting a quick, embarrassing defeat, a confirmation of their assumptions about people like Diego, people like her. Victoria opened with a standard pawn move, King's Pawn, dear, a classic opening we learned at Harvard. Diego responded instantly. No gestation, no visible thought process. Carmen didn't know much about chess, but she knew her son, and she could see something in his posture that made her pulse quicken. The same stillness he had when he was solving complex math problems, when he was 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Interesting, murmured one of the guests as Diego's response registered. Victoria's confident smile flickered for just a moment, just long enough for Carmen to notice. The game continued, Victoria taking longer and longer to make her moves, Diego responding with the same instant precision. Carmen watched the faces of the guests change from amused anticipation to confused attention. Something was happening that they hadn't expected. Carmen found herself holding her breath as the pieces moved across the board in patterns she couldn't understand, but could feel building towards something significant. She could see Victoria's confidence cracking, could see doubt creeping into the eyes of guests who had been so certain about the outcome. And she could see her son playing with a mastery that even she hadn't fully comprehended. This wasn't just a game to Diego. This was years of solitary study, years of dedication that no one in this room could imagine, years of proving to himself that intelligence had nothing to do with zip codes or bank accounts. Carmen realized she was watching her son do more than play chess. She was watching him rewrite every assumption in that room about who deserved respect. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next would prove that a mother's faith in her child can be the most powerful force in the world. Carmen watched Victoria's face grow pale as the game progressed. The woman who had been so confident, so condescending, was now staring at the board like it contained a puzzle she couldn't solve. Because it did. Diego had created a position that Carmen couldn't understand but could feel in the tension of the room. The guests had stopped their casual chatter. Even Mr. Hamilton had put down his champagne glass and was leaning forward, studying the board with the intensity of someone who was beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Your move, Mrs. Whitman," Diego said softly. Carmen heard something in her son's voice she had never heard before. Not arrogance, not anger, but a quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Victoria's hand hovered over her pieces for nearly a full minute. Carmen could see her trying different moves in her mind, rejecting each one. The woman who had invited Diego to play as a joke was now trapped in a game that was no longer funny. "This is taking quite a while," commented Congresswoman Mills from her seat by the window. "Perhaps the boy is better than we expected." Carmen felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes, not just because Diego was winning, but because he was doing it with the same grace and dignity he had shown when Victoria first insulted him. Her son had learned something that all of Victoria's money couldn't buy: how to maintain his character under pressure. Victoria finally made her move, and Carmen saw Diego's eyes light up with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Not cruel satisfaction, but the quiet pleasure of someone who had just seen a plan come together perfectly. "Check," Diego said simply, moving his queen to a position that made Victoria gasp audibly. The word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Carmen didn't need to understand chess to know that something decisive had just happened. She could see it in the way the guests straightened in their chairs, in the way Victoria's confident mask finally slipped completely. That's not possible," Victoria muttered, staring at the board as if the pieces might rearrange themselves into a position that made more sense to her. But Diego wasn't finished. Carmen watched her son look around the room at each guest, his gaze steady and calm. When he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that silenced every adult present. Mrs. Whitman, would you like to know something? I didn't learn chess to beat people like you. I learned it because it taught me that every piece on the board has value, even the pawns, even the pieces that start in the back row. He paused, and Carmen felt her heart swell with pride at the wisdom in her 17-year-old son's words. You invited me to play because you thought I would be easy to defeat, because you assumed that where I come from determines what I'm capable of. But chess doesn't care about your address. It doesn't care about your bank account. It only cares about how well you think. Carmen saw Victoria's face flush red, but Diego wasn't done. My mother works 3 jobs to keep me in school. She walks to work to save bus fare so I can have lunch money. She's never owned anything as expensive as the pieces on this board, but she taught me something more valuable than any of this. Diego gestured around the opulent room. She taught me that respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't care. Her son had just articulated everything she had tried to teach him through years of struggle and sacrifice. And he had done it while systematically dismantling the chess game of a woman who thought poverty was a punchline. Checkmate, Diego said quietly, making his final move. Carmen didn't understand the position, but she understood the finality in her son's voice. She understood the stunned silence that filled the room. She understood that her boy had just accomplished something that would change both of their lives forever. Victoria stared at the board for a long moment, then looked up at Diego with an expression Carmen had never seen on her employer's face before. Fear. Not fear of Diego, but fear of what she had just revealed about herself in front of the most important people in her social circle. I don't understand how. Victoria began, but her voice trailed off. Carmen stepped forward for the first time since the game began. For 20 years, she had remained invisible in this house, had accepted insults and condescension because she needed the work. But watching her son display such grace under pressure had given her a courage she didn't know she possessed. Mrs. Whitman, Carmen said, her voice steady and clear, my son has been studying chess for 8 years. Every day after school, every weekend, every summer. While other kids played video games, Diego read chess books. While other kids went to camps and vacations, Diego analyzed grandmaster games on a computer he fixed himself. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who had underestimated her family. You thought this would be entertaining. You thought my son would embarrass himself for your amusement, but the only person who should be embarrassed tonight is you. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Carmen had never spoken to Victoria this way, had never spoken to any employer this way. But watching Diego handle himself with such dignity had reminded her that she too deserved respect. Congresswoman Mills stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Diego. Young man, how old are you? 17, ma'am, Diego replied. And you taught yourself to play chess? Yes, ma'am, with help from library books and online videos. Mills pulled out her phone and began typing. I know several universities that would be very interested in meeting you. Full scholarships for students with your kind of determination. Carmen felt her knees go weak. Scholarships. Universities. The dream she had harbored for Diego but never dared speak aloud. Victoria finally found her voice. I didn't expect. I was just trying to. You were trying to humiliate a child, Judge Hamilton said sharply, in front of witnesses, for entertainment. Carmen watched as the reality of the situation settled over Victoria like a heavy blanket. The woman who had wielded her wealth and status like weapons had just been defeated by a teenager she had tried to mock. And everyone had seen it happen. Diego began putting the chess pieces back in their starting positions with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the game. Thank you for the match, Mrs. Whitman. It was educational. When he finished, he turned to Carmen. Mama, are you ready to go home? I have homework to finish. Carmen nodded, removing her apron for the last time. She knew she would never work in this house again. But for the first time in 20 years, she didn't care. As they walked toward the door, Congresswoman Mills handed Diego her business card. Call me Monday morning. We have a lot to discuss. Carmen and Diego stepped out into the Beverly Hills night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never again assume that talent and intelligence were privileges reserved for the wealthy. Mama, Diego said as they walked to their old car, are you proud of me? Carmen stopped walking and pulled her son into a hug that contained 20 years of love, sacrifice, and dreams deferred but never abandoned. Mijo, she whispered, I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. As they drove home to their small apartment, Carmen realized that tonight had been about more than chess. It had been about dignity, about refusing to accept other people's limitations, about proving that true nobility comes not from what you own, but from who you choose to be when the world tries to make you small. Diego had chosen to be magnificent. And in doing so, he had shown everyone in that room what real class looked like. 6 months later, Carmen Santos stood in the audience at Stanford University, watching her son receive a full academic scholarship. The video of that night in Beverly Hills had gone viral, shared by Congresswoman Mills herself. Teenage chess prodigy defeats prejudiced millionaire had been viewed over 3 million times, turning Diego into a symbol of triumph over adversity and Victoria into a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption. Carmen had been promoted to head of housekeeping at a luxury hotel in Santa Monica, not because of pity, but because her 20 years of impeccable work ethic had finally been recognized by employers who valued character over connections. Diego had started a free chess program for kids in underserved communities. In 6 months, over 1,000 children were learning not just how to play chess, but how to think strategically about their futures. Chess taught me that every move matters, Diego explained during a CNN interview. Mrs. Whitman taught me that some people need to lose everything to learn what really matters. When asked if he held any resentment toward the woman who had tried to humiliate him, Diego smiled with the same calm dignity he had shown that night. Resentment is like playing with broken pieces. It only hurts your own game. I prefer to focus on winning. Carmen watched that interview from her new apartment, furnished with pieces she had bought with her own money for the first time in her life. On the wall hung a photo of Diego receiving his scholarship, next to a certificate from his chess program. Victoria Whitman had tried to make her son entertainment, but Diego Santos had become inspiration. And that difference, Carmen knew, was what separated true winners from people who just thought they were winning. The phone rang. It was Diego calling from his dorm room at Stanford. Mama, he said, I just wanted to tell you something. Everything good that happened tonight, everything good that's happening now, it all started with you believing in me when no one else would. Carmen smiled, looking out the window of her new home toward a future that suddenly seemed full of infinite possibilities. No, mijo, she replied. It started with you refusing to let anyone else define what you were capable of. But you taught me that, Mama. No, Diego, you taught me. And as Carmen hung up the phone, she realized that the greatest victory of all wasn't Diego's chess game or his scholarship or his viral fame. It was the moment her son had looked at a room full of people who thought they were better than him and proven that character, not circumstances, determines who you really are. Victoria Whitman had wealth, status, and power. But Diego Santos had something she could never buy, the unshakable knowledge that his worth came from within. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story of a mother's love and a son's triumph has touched your heart, Subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to remember that greatness isn't inherited. It's earned through determination, dignity, and the courage to prove that you're more than what others assume you to be. Because somewhere right now, there's another Diego waiting for someone to believe in their potential instead of their circumstances. And that someone could be you.